Our next speaker is Wojciech Reguła, and Wojciech is a principal IT security specialist specialized in application security on Apple devices. Serial bounder, he has shared his research at the most important conferences around the globe. Today, he will show us how he puts his skill together to find a way to extract credentials from popular macOS password manager. So, Wojciech, the stage is yours.
Yeah, so hello, Nohad. I'm so happy to be here with you today. Thank you for coming to the talk after lunch. I know it's hard. So today's talk is Broken Isolation, Draining Your Credentials from Popular macOS Password Managers. So as I was introduced, I'm Wojciech Reguła. I'm a head of mobile security at Securing. I spent too much time on researching Apple stuff. I have now over 60 CVs in Apple, so too much time spent on it. Focused on iOS and macOS application security. Somebody of you may know me from the Certified iOS Application Security Engineer course that I am an author of. In my free time, as I was already introduced, I run a blog, wojciechregula.blog, where I document all my findings that I identified in the Apple products, but not only in the Apple products. And I'm also an iOS Security Suite creator, which is a which is an open source anti-tampering framework that helps developers making sure that the iOS applications are run on secure iPhones. So before we start talking about the technical stuff, I'd like to ask you some questions. So the first question is, who of you uses macOS? Okay, quite a lot of people. So the second question is, who of you uses macOS because it's a nice-looking Linux? Okay, there's also so many people. So this talk will be about telling you that macOS and Linux are completely different operating systems. They are both Unix, but the security assumptions they're completely different. All right, so let me share with you the agenda for today's talk. So at first, I'm going to introduce you to the basic macOS security mechanisms, to the isolation, to the whole idea of the security boundaries that we have on macOS. I even will show you a diagram about operating systems history. And when I will finish the long introduction, because there will be a lot of theory at the beginning, which is really important to understand before I start exploitation, we're going to get through like 5 password managers. I will ask you if you use any of them, but that will be on the later phase of this talk. And at the end, because I don't like leaving especially developers without recommendations, I will give you some ideas how you can secure your macOS applications. And then the end, of course, the conclusion when we conclude everything. So let me start with the introduction, and we start from the history of operating systems. That's a huge diagram taken from Wikipedia. Thank you for that. And I put it in here on purpose because I want you to convince you that macOS is absolutely not a Linux. So where do we have Linux? Linux is in here, right? We can see. And here we have the macOS X. And you can see that macOS X actually is a child from FreeBSD and NextStep, which means that if you think about macOS, you should think more about FreeBSD than Linux, and it has some security implications. So macOS X has a hybrid kernel, which is a combination with FreeBSD kernel with the NextStep kernel. And so what does it mean in practice? So from the FreeBSD, the part taken from the FreeBSD of the kernel is responsible for process management, signal handling, user and group management, syscalls, TCP, IP stack, and sockets. So this is the, let's say, Unix part of the macOS. But we have the second part of the kernel, which is the Mac microkernel, which is responsible for processor scheduling, multitasking, virtual memory management, inter-process communication, and Mac traps. There are so many more, but just to give you the quick understanding. So Mac and BSD each maintain different security models, and Mac's security model is based on port rights, whereas BSD security model operates on a process ownership. So you now understand there is a process ownership, like in the Unix, and we have the Mac ports, which is like a completely different concept. And now, of course, we have more Apple operating systems like macOS, watchOS, visionOS, iOS, tvOS, iPadOS, but under the hood they run the very same kernel. Of course, the kernel has some modifications, but the general idea of hybrid microkernel, where there's two words are connected, is still the same, and I want you to really understand that. So this is a diagram taken from Apple documentation a few years ago, which is the main concept of how the operation systems made by Apple work. So on the software level, you can see that we have a file system, and we have OS partition. And OS partition is something that doesn't have to be encrypted. So if you take your Mac, and you think, okay, everything on my laptop is encrypted, that's absolutely not true. The operating system partition is not encrypted, it's sealed. It's like a cryptographic hash on the partition. It's not encrypted. The only thing that's encrypted is user partition. This is where you store the data, right? So this must be encrypted, and this is encrypted by default. And the concept is that all the applications should be put in app sandbox with some data protection classes. And of course, on macOS, if you use it, you probably know that not every application must be sandboxed. This is not mandatory. For example, on iOS, sandboxing is mandatory. However, on macOS, it's not. But is it really true? There is something called system integrity protection, which is I like to say it as it was a global hallucination sandbox, because even though if you are not sandboxed, in practice you are sandboxed. There's a huge global security, sandbox security profile that makes all applications to be in sandbox, except they have some special permissions. But we're gonna cover it later. So the idea is that we have sandboxed apps on the operating system, and then we, on the hardware and firmware level, we have the kernel, which has secure enclave and secure elements. And of course, secure enclave is the hardware-based key manager that's isolated from the main processor, just to provide an extra layer of security. So even if your kernel gets compromised, we have a separate chip that handles some security operations, like, for example, decryption of your disk, or storing some sensitive data in your keychain, and actually decrypting it from the keychain. So the basic things to understand in the beginning, that macOS is not Linux. And the basic assumption in here is that applications running at the same user ID should not be able to control themselves. Usually on Linux, if you have a process running with the same UID as you are freely able to just control it. On macOS, that should not be possible. So if an application wants to be controlled by other apps, for example, debuggers, when you are developing an application, it must be signed with a special entitlement, which is com-apple get task allow. So your application must deliberately say, hey, I'm an application, I want to be debugged. Your application must deliberately say that by assigning an entitlement in the code sign. And you may ask, all right, but for example, in Linux, we have a ptrace. This is a syscall which allows process injections, code injections. And yeah, on macOS, we also have ptrace. But the thing you must remember is that ptrace is not fully implemented on macOS. So even though we have ptrace syscall, it doesn't mean you can control another process with ptrace, because the whole memory injection things in ptrace on macOS are not implemented. So there is no fully working ptrace. Great, so now let me introduce you to some isolation mechanisms. But why do we even care about this? Why the cross-process isolation is that important on macOS? Because if you are able to cross this security boundary, you would be able to, for example, impersonate private entitlements, which will lead to TCC bypass. And the TCC is that mechanism, so when you have Mac or iPhone and your application wants, for example, get access to camera, there will be a prompt, right? An application wants to get access to your camera. So even if you are a root, you should not be able to bypass this prompt. There is no way to, auto-click, for example. So if you'd like, for example, even to perform a synthetic click on that prompt, that will not work. Apple really makes sure that only user physically must click on the prompt to give the privacy entitlements. So if an application has already the privacy permissions you assign to it because you clicked the prompt, for example, Microsoft Teams, I allow to screen share, I allow my microphone, I allow my camera, you would be able to inject code to Microsoft Teams, for example, and get its permissions, right? So this is really important. If you can inject code to other applications and impersonate private entitlements, you can bypass TCP. But what else you can do? As I told you, we have the micro kernel taken from the next step. So we have the private entitlements that will allow us to change the user because of it. So for example, with private entitlements impersonation, we'd be able to elevate our privileges from user to root, because as I told you, that's a bit different concept that we have on Linux. User is not that important than entitlements are. So with impersonation of private entitlements, we would be also able to bypass the system integrity protection. So the global hallucination sandbox will begin with the impersonation of them. But it would be harmful also to third-party services like XPC that perform user-to-root local privilege escalations, or would be able to inject our code to apps that are already, granted with the TCC permissions. So this is why that security boundary of injecting, code to other processes is that important. Because actually, if we can inject our code to other processes, that would mean that no security mechanisms on macOS are effective. And thankfully, we have Apple Platform Security White Paper published by Apple, which is a really great resource. However, not everything is documented. I wish I had seen such a presentation 10 years ago when I started my macOS journey, because I will be telling you some things that are absolutely not documented, and I had to reverse engineer them at that time. So, yeah. Let's talk now about the system integrity protection, about the global hallucination sandbox I told you about. So on macOS, even if you are root, you are not a god. You are not like on Linux, so you can do everything with your operating system. You should not be able, even with root, to modify the OS partition, for example. It's sealed. There is a protection maintained by SIP that will disallow you doing it. And itself, system integrity protection is enforced on a very low level. It's a sandbox kernel extension. And effectively, it will restrict access to many directories on macOS. But it will also deny debugger attachments to processes that are directly signed by Apple. And the last point from these bullet points, when turned off, there is no privacy on macOS. So, believe me, I saw it too many times. So if you go to Stack Overflow with some question that, oh, my application does not work, or I can load a plugin to, a software that I run on my macOS, and you will see the most voted answer, okay, but you disable SIP and you will be fine. Like it will start working. So please do not do that. I saw it too many times on Stack Overflow. That's the most rated, answer because it works. So yeah, people say, yeah, that's a good answer. It works. Yes, but it disables the whole idea of the security on macOS. So this is why it works. So there will be no protection. So if your Mac protects you from loading a malicious library, for example, or a library that has not been signed with the same certificate, SIP will prevent it. If SIP is disabled, there is no privacy, there is no protections. You can impersonate entitlements of other applications, which effectively bypasses everything on macOS. No SIP disablement, please. So if you manage your Macs in an organization you work for, and you have a centralized management of those devices, please verify if all your Macs in the organization have the SIP enabled, because it's really, really important. So how can we see if the SIP is turned on? So you go to terminal, and with CSR util status, you can just check it. It's easy. All right, so let's do an experiment. Let's inject, for example, to logdaemon, which is Apple's signed process, And for that purpose, we will use LLDB, which is Apple's debugger. So that should theoretically work if you were on Linux, right? But you will see that the attachment has been failed. Let's see what happened in the logs. You would see that, okay, so there is a debug server that was about to call task for pit, which is a Mac trap. And in the end, the debug server told us, oh, the attachment has failed. But as you can see, we are root, right? So yeah, that's what I told you. So debugging a process, which gives us, a path to code execution within the process context, requires getting the task word of the debugee. So we are not in the Unix world. We are now in the Mac world, because we are not talking about processes. We are talking about task ports. So we are in the part of the microkernel, which is not absolutely nothing with Unix. It's a different concept. So it involves using the task for pit function, which actually is a Mac trap. So it's a syscall, but not in the FreeBSD Unix part. It's a syscall in the next step microkernel part. This is called Mac trap. And as we've just seen, the calling the task for pit is highly restricted on macOS and is possible only under some circumstances that are really strict. I will share with it in a moment. And the task for pit requests are controlled by the taskgate daemon and MFI, which stands for Apple Mobile File Integrity daemon. So this is the guide for process injections, which is a kind of complicated, but it's really not documented anywhere publicly on Apple Docs. So if you're interested in macOS security research, you can take a screenshot of it, because this is really important to know before you start even attacking third-party applications. So when SIP is enabled, the system integrity protection, which is the default configuration, the task port retrieval is not possible when the targeted app is a platform binary or has hardened runtime. Platform binary means that it's signed by Apple and it's on macOS pre-installed, or has the hardened runtime, which I will explain later. And if the debugee holds a public getTaskAllow entitlement, which means like, I want to be debugged, the injection is possible even by the same user, because our application deliberately say, I want to be debugged. So for example, you are developing an application, you're on Xcode, you want automatically LLDB to be attached to the application. So under the hood, what Xcode does, it's code signs the application with that entitlement. So that works. But if the debugee can have the hardened runtime or doesn't have the hardened runtime and was signed without the getTaskAllow entitlement, so there is your application doesn't say, I want to be deliberately debugged, the injection is possible but with root permissions. So the hardened runtime must be turned off, and there is no getTaskAllow entitlement set on that executable. Then with root, we can debug the application. And the injection is always possible when the debugger application holds a private system task for entitlement. And just for your information, LLDB or other public debugger doesn't have such an entitlement. So there is no, probably in Apple they have such a debugger with that entitlement. However, like the public version of LLDB doesn't have it, and it's good, right? Because you now know that if you are able to cross the process isolation boundary, that the game is over. Okay, but can we just assign ourselves a private entitlement? So let's do another experiment. So we have a simple C hello world application. There we have an entitlements.xml with definition of common Apple private TCC manager entitlement, which is of course private. We sign it with these entitlement, and at the end you will see that it gets killed right after we try to launch this application. And if you go to logs, you will see that Apple Mobile File Integrity daemon indeed killed that application. So unfortunately, we will not be able to do it. And there is a fun fact. In Big Sur beta in 2020, I found that plenty of Apple executables that had private entitlements and had getTaskAllow, which meant that I could just simply inject to those applications and impersonate their entitlements, which of course was fixed as this CVE. Okay, so we now have a brief understanding what is required to debug another app. So for injecting our code to third-party applications, which will be password managers, we'll be looking for applications that have get task allow or are signed without the hardened runtime. For that, we will need root, but that's also an idea. So what is the hardened runtime? And according to Apple, let me read it, the hardened runtime, along with the system integrity protection, protects the runtime integrity of your software by preventing certain classes of exploits like code injection, dynamically linked library, hijacking, and process memory space tampering. So long story short, it blocks code injection. That's the purpose why hardened runtime has been introduced. So nowadays, all of the applications downloaded from the internet must be notarized. And notarization is a process when you develop an application, you package it, you send it to Apple, they will verify if your application is free of malware, and they will stamp it so you can distribute your application and other users may download it. And if you read into the notarization documentation provided by Apple, notarization will always verify if your application has the hardened runtime turned on. So in theory, all the applications downloaded from the internet should not be, a good victim for code injections because they should have been notarized, right? So theoretically, in the case of this talk, when we will be focusing on password managers, but as you can see, that research can be applied to other third-party applications, the hardened runtime must be turned on. And how we can verify if the hardened runtime has been turned on? So it's enforced by a setting and a code signing attribute. And as this part of the operating system is open source, you can go on GitHub and search for this file for csblobs.h, and you will see that there is a flag called csruntime, which applies the hardened runtime policies. So in order to check it, simply from our researcher's perspective, we just use code sign -d -v and on GarageBand, for example, and you will see that we have flags with runtime. But does hardened runtime protect us from every kind of code injection? Theoretically no. Practically, no. because there are some runtime exceptions. So we can say, okay, I want my application to be runtime hardened, but I don't want to have all those restrictions on my process because, I don't know, I'm a browser, I'm an Electron application, or whatever. And there are two especially interesting exceptions for us. So the first one is built environment entitlement and disabled library validation entitlement. So the combination of those two effectively allows us to inject code to the application we target. So the DILT insert libraries is like LD preload on Linux. You probably know that. Do you know the LD preload environment variable in Linux? Yeah, I can see you say yes. So I assume so. So on macOS we have something called DILT insert libraries that just insert a library to a process. However, the library that is injected to the process must be signed with the same def ID, which when disabled library validation entitlement is turned on, this verification will not happen by the operating system. So that's why we need the combination of those two. So how can we see if there is actually the hardened runtime exception set on the application? For example, if you go to code sign -d -- entitlements on Firefox, you will see that, there is a disabled library validation turned on. I reported it to Firefox, I think in 2020 or something, and they told me that, yes, we need to maintain this because we still support Flash. So we need to have the disabled library validation, which effectively allowed us to get all the Firefox privacy entitlements like location, like your opening on camera, microphone, screen sharing, because you usually allow Firefox doing that, right? For example, you have a Teams meeting on Firefox or a Zoom meeting on Firefox without camera, and or use Google Maps. So you want to give the Firefox permission to access your location, right? Because you want to see where are you on the Google Maps. So, well, anyway, that's another story. So this is the last slide about the the guide on how can we inject to other applications. So we'll be looking for apps with get-task-allow, no hardened runtime, or with hardened runtime but with useful exceptions. Or we'll be looking for custom debugging features that don't depend on get-task-allow. It's wink, wink, Electron. All right, so there's a bit long theory. So now let's focus on the exploitation. So let's go to the pawning popular password managers. But as you can see, this research, I wanted this talk to be really educational because my last presentations on, I had 3 black hat presentations about 0 days, about attacking the privacy mechanisms. I found like 50-something CVs in the privacy mechanisms. Then I had a DEF CON talk about attacking Electron applications. That was always about 0 days, like, you know, like there's like 30 minutes presentation with 30 vulnerabilities. So one after one, I was, you know, presenting the vulnerabilities. But now I wanted to give you an educational talk where you actually understand what is the difference, what are the assumptions. So you can apply this research also to all other third-party applications, to antiviruses, to VPNs, to password managers. Password managers are just an example. Please treat it like that. So coming back to the point. MacPass, a really popular password manager. Who of you uses MacPass, by the way? Are there any people in the audience? Yeah, there are so many. Like, I would say like 15 people in the audience that uses the MacPass. That's good. It's really popular. So what we do before we start even reverse engineering the MacPass, we will check for the hardened runtime, right? And what we can see. It has hardened runtime turned on, but there is a disable library violation set to true. Why is that? So maybe if MacPass will not check for, you know, code signing attribute, code signing identity on the libraries, maybe we can just change one of its libraries and have directly code execution, right, within the MacPass. We cannot do it as simple as like build insert libraries because there is no such exception. We have only exception for loading dynamic libraries, but we cannot set the dynamic library we want to load. So maybe we can just change one of its dynamic libraries, but unfortunately not. There is a new feature called app protection that will allow only an application with a special TCP permission to modify the application's directory. And the decision made by the daemon that handles it will be if the application was signed directly by Apple certificate or by the same team ID. Because, for example, we have an application which has an updater, right? So this is a separate application, but updater must be able to change the directory of the app it updates. So this is why it has been made like this. But unfortunately, we don't have access to the signing certificate of like a app we want to inject, in this case, MacPass. So let's now think why, in general, MacPass has the disable library validation at all. Because it allows loading custom plugins. For example, you want the password manager to load a custom plugin that, for example, will allow you unlock the vault by Touch ID. So you need to, you know, give developers functionality that they can inject to the process memory and, you know, provide a new functionality. So that's why. And all of the plugins that MacPass stores are in library application support MacPass. So they are now in a protected directory. This is unprotected directory, so every application running with standard permissions can write to this particular directory. So we can just abuse a feature, load a malicious plugin that will dump everything from MacPass. Let me show you the demo. So we take the identifier of MacPass. We see where is the database located. It's in the defaults of MacPass. Now let's change one of the defaults property to load incompatible plugins. Any application may do this. And now let's copy our plugin to the final directory where MacPass takes the plugins from. And now open MacPass. So after our victim authenticates, the decryption key along with all the entries will be saved to TMP. And that's it. No root was required, no additional TCC permission was required. We just made it as a regular user. And if you take a look at the exploit, it's really simple. All we do is a method swizzling, nothing complicated. We just abuse the feature of MacPass. And here I can make another question to you. Who thinks this is a vulnerability? Raise your hand if you think this was a vulnerability. Who of you thinks this is just a feature and it works like intended? Hard, right? Like I would say, like it's 50-50, right? Like looking at the audience, so we can discuss it after the talk. All right, another password manager then. Bitwarden. Who is Bitwarden? Yeah, so many people. So it's an open source password manager with a premium plan. It's written in Electron and it's distributed by Mac App Store. So now let's continue our research. So we will start from verifying hardened runtime, right? It has no hardened runtime, but it has been downloaded from the internet, right? So did I lie to you that notarization enforces hardened runtime? No, I didn't lie to you. The reason is that notarization is enforced on applications downloaded directly from the internet. I mean, like from browser, from like your chat or something. But if it's downloaded from Mac App Store, there is no enforcement on notarization. So we can simply inject a dynamic library with tilt-insert libraries to that and we'll be fine. So does it mean that software downloaded directly from your browser is more secure than the software downloaded from Mac App Store? That's kind of strange, right? So let's take a look at Apple's documentation. So we are in the documentation and at the hardened runtime capability, which is not necessary for App Store apps, but is a best practice for the code. Okay, so if you are a developer that wants to distribute an application on their website, you must, pass the really strict notarization things. But if you want to be a developer that distributes your app through Mac App Store, there's even no hardened runtime enforced to it. This is a best practice. So let's take a look at the exploitation. I'm going to use a simple keylogger in Bitwarden. I'm just inserting a library, open Bitwarden. And the password has been, I can of course dump all the entries, but this is just for proof of concept reasons. I just wanted to show you that I'm able to inject code directly to Bitwarden. The keylogger is really simple. It's on my GitHub, so if you'd like to download it, feel free to do it. I open source almost everything I do. So who thinks that was a vulnerability? Who thinks it's a feature? Yeah, no. Most of you think it's a vulnerability. I would say so. I would say that's as well a vulnerability. All right, so who uses NordPass, another password manager? Okay, so NordPass is not really that popular as Bitwarden was on this conference, but still. It's downloaded directly from the internet. It's a popular password manager written in Electron, and some critical Electron fuses are turned on, which allows code injection. That's a debugging feature of Electron. It does not depend on task4pit or anything like that. That's a strictly Electron's feature. And last year, I made a talk on DEF CON in Las Vegas when I shared my tool for auto-exploitation of Electron applications. That's called Electronizer. If you are interested, you can see that talk that is here. I pointed on it. But anyway, how can we see if the fuses are, the critical fuses that allow debugging are enabled? we just use the npx, and we can see that NordPass has the enabled no CLI inspect arguments enabled. And Electron apps are like browsers with JavaScript and HTML code, right? So this is like a, let's say, an embedded browser within the application, right? And if you open your browser, you can just right-click and inspect, and you will have the JavaScript console, right? Electron applications are, as I said, like browsers. So we can inject JavaScript code to the applications because this is a development feature, right? So by abusing this fact, we can simply inject our JavaScript code to NordPass because it's a, as I said, like an embedded browser. So we will export some environment variables. We'll set a log file because that will make our exploitation easy. And now I used my own tool that I created to steal the entries. So under the hood, it opens the WebSocket connection. The NordPass is being launched. I enter my master password. So it opened. And now I can just take the master password and the vault, so I can decrypt it for myself. So that's it. Who thinks this is a feature? Who thinks this is a vulnerability? So vulnerability first. Who thinks this is a feature? This is Electron feature. I didn't hack anything. Like this is on purpose, right? Electron developers made it to allow the developers injecting code to their own browser-based applications. This is up to you. And the exploit is really easy. Like this is like a few lines of HTML code. So now let's focus on KeePassXC, which is also downloaded from the internet. It's native, written in Qt, really well documented. Really big kudos to the developers. It's really good password manager. Who uses KeePassXC? A lot of people in the audience again. This is really well documented. But now we're gonna focus on a browser extension that KeePassXC has to show you, different perspectives on that. And because we don't have too much time, I will not dive into it. This is like asymmetric crypto between browser extension and the main process, but it doesn't matter for this talk. The problem is that browsers on macOS are not known for the best isolation mechanisms. And we can just simply grab the private key from the local storage of the browser and just spoof the connection with the main application. Let me show you the demo. It's really easy. So we have the extension in the browser. In this case, it's Chrome. We can see like I have some entries in KeePassXC. So this is the whole code I used to get the entries. There's a cool library already written, KeePassXC proxy client, that was probably created not for malicious purposes. So with this command, I'm taking the name of the connection and the private key from the browser, from its files, because browsers are not sandboxed. I save it, run it, and I have all the entries. So that's that easy. Like the KeePassXC didn't do anything wrong, right? It's implemented as it, let's say, should be implemented. The problem lies on the browser side, that browsers are not well isolated, so anybody can mess with their files. So who now thinks this is a vulnerability? Okay, who thinks this is a feature? All right, exploit really simple. And the last password manager, it's a plugin-only password manager, so there's no standalone macOS application. It's Proton Pass. So everything, all the decryption, encryption happens in the browser's JavaScript runtime, right? There is no separate app. So the isolation is not really well enforced on browsers, as I told you. And there is a framework called Selenium, and browsers deliberately allow developers to use Selenium to instrument the browsers. It's for QA testers, for example. It's for web testing purposes. So it's a feature. So I wrote a script, a Python script that just launches NordPass, allows it to decrypt itself. I don't even care what encryption they use. I just automated it, and I'm taking the login and password. And I don't care what has been used there. I just used Selenium to script it, and I get the decrypted part. So who thinks this is a vulnerability? And the feature? From my perspective, that's an architectonical problem, right? This is not a feature, not a vulnerability. This is a problem in the architecture of writing a password manager. This is just a plugin. OK, so that was the, I forgot to show you the code. This is simple, right? This is a few lines of Python in Selenium. So to sum everything up, at the beginning of this talk, I showed you some basic security assumptions on macOS. I think I was able to convince you that the assumptions are absolutely different. This is not a Linux. We have the Mac ports, right? The task for PIT is the thing we can get the ability to inject code within other process memory. So we went through different password managers. I showed you that if the isolation is not enforced on processes, we can, for example, grab all the entries from the password managers. There were 5 password managers. They have different problems. Some of you showed that by raising your hand that there are features. Somebody of you told me that those are vulnerabilities. I'm inviting you to open a discussion after this presentation. So the last thing I wanted to tell you about are the recommendations that I always want to give you if you develop applications. So enable hardened runtime, review the exceptions, enable sandboxing, because now TCC protects containers of sandboxed apps, notarize your applications, not only installers, and if you use Electron, disable all the problematic features. And of course, pen test your apps. And as I told you at the beginning of this talk, I'm an author of iOS Application Security Engineer. So if you are an iOS developer or an iOS apps pen tester, here's a discount for a no-hat community. So feel free to reach me out if you'd like to see the course before you buy it. And that's it for today. Thank you very much.